We'll start with Chapter 7 of our text, Johnson and Hackman. The purpose of the chapter is to improve your chances of having a productive group experience by building your understanding of group and team leadership. Talk a little bit about the differences there. We'll also start by looking at some fundamentals of group behavior and then talk about emergent leadership, leading meetings, decision making, and of course, team leadership. Now, to bring this back to communication, you have to understand that in order for a group to exist, members must engage in regular communication. Of course, if you're in the same location, a lot of that communication may take place face to face. But workers at different sites, of course, they're going to communicate via email or online meetings, video conferences, telephone calls, you name it. Here's the thing to keep in mind. The basic principles of effective communication remain the same, regardless of how that communication takes place. There are little nuances, little tricks that you learn in terms of effectiveness and engagement, but the basic principles stay the same. And that's good news for us in the communication business because we can rely upon that to help improve leaders' communication skills. Now, as part of this chapter, Fisher discovered 4 phases in group decision making, and it's very similar to the 4 phases of decision making or group formation that I have taught for many years. You may be familiar with it. Those are the phases of forming, storming, norming, and performing. So when you read those, kind of compare it to that if you're familiar, and it might help kind of bring that more sense into that philosophy. Now, if you look at table 7.1 on page 223, you'll be able to assess your skills as a meeting leader. Take that test. And perhaps, if you're fortunate enough, you could ask someone else to evaluate you on the same questions and maybe compare those and see how that works for you. All right, our first additional reading this week is Leung and Wong. They talk about prior theorizing about the positive effect of cultural diversity. Especially its effect on team creativity and the cognitive perspective. And that cognitive perspective is based on the benefit of diverse knowledge and perspective, right? Now, the role of negative social process is generated by cultural diversity. In other words, problems that team members face often occur when they're interacting with each other, but that has received little attention. So the authors here kind of dive deeper into that and give you some additional perspectives that I think you'll find helpful. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that, of course, communication processes are needed to share and integrate task-relevant knowledge. Right? We've got to have communication to know what we're doing. It's also relevant for the experiences, for the intercultural obstacles that may present themselves, and, of course, characterized by communication. There may be some misunderstanding or perhaps even conflict, which obviously hinders knowledge sharing and integration across cultural boundaries. So they explore that. I encourage you to read their findings and see how it might apply to your own organization. Now, one other note about this Liu and Wong article before we move on. They talked about how the lack of physical contact in virtual teams often impedes strong ties and cooperative relationships. You may have experienced this on your own if you worked remotely or have worked remotely. You've got to overcome that, especially if you're a leader, and you've got to find ways to bring that group identity together. And it's especially important in order to resolve any conflict management issues. So when you think about this, to bring it back to a kind of a communication as well as a global leadership perspective, if you've got globally distributed teams, the problems that they encountered are often attributed to negative personal dispositions, and that can lead to making disputes even more difficult to resolve. So those are some of the additional challenges that we look at when we look at global strategic communication. Okay, the final article that we're going to look at this week is Nickerson and Goby. They examine ways to counteract the arbitrary mix of organizational communication practices that evolved in the Gulf region. And they looked at kind of the different kind of cultures that make up the workforce there. They attempt to develop a conceptual model of leadership communication. They call this the Gulf Leadership Communication Framework. Now, this is focused on the Gulf, But I encourage you to read it and see if there's any tidbits in there that you can tease out and perhaps apply to your own situation or other leadership communication opportunities that you have. I also encourage you to review the relevant research that they have starting on page 183. It's nice because they kind of give a whole literature review of communication that shows the various type of leadership that have been identified around the world. So it's the reason I chose this article, because I thought it gave us a real good perspective in one location to kind of see how different leadership types are viewed and used and studied around the world. So make sure you take a look at that. I think you'll find some interesting information that applies directly to the course-related principles that we're learning this term. Okay, that's it for now. As always, stay ahead with all assignments, stay engaged in the discussion board, and of course, enjoy your time of learning.